I can start. Um, well, I tend to think of an institution almost like a vehicle um, that carries a vision or a mission or an agenda forward long term. Um, and it sort of becomes like a container that you continue to maintain, develop, work on. Maybe you put some racing stripes on. Maybe the tires get bald. Maybe you want to upsize your grip or get it set for summer or get it set for winter or ice or something. And institutions can be cultures, they can be households, they can be organizations, they can be a mission statement. They can be, I mean, you can go as far as like think about like guerrilla warfare where there's a headless movement. It's still an institution, right? It defines people's actions, attitudes, and work around and with reference to that thing, that vehicle. And for myself, growing up in West Oakland, and we've had some incredibly historically notable institutions that are both birthed and died in the same cultural space. And I've had personally, as a child coming out of a family business, I've had, and as a cultural anthropologist who focuses on institutions and agents of institutions and how it is a cultural space of production. It's not as objective and definitive as one might imagine. And I've always had a fascination with how institutions coming out of Black Power movement, consciousness raising movements lived and died within 1 to 2 generations, right? Like, what is the function of an institution that dies before you can birth the grandchild of the founder? Um, and I've been part of the founding of a couple of institutions that turns out, despite how promising they were incredibly fragile. And in the end, in some ways, harmed people as much as they helped people. And so the hope with East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative was to think through how some of those dynamics of fragile grassroots institutions work and build into the DNA of this institution um, explicit intentions around mitigation, experimental pathways, um, and the question of, we've been talking, a lot of organizations are talking about succession. I think I'm talking about inheritance, right? How do you keep the culture and transmit it from one generation of org members, institution members to the next, right? 10, 15 years ago, they called it mission drift. But for a grassroots institution, it really is culture. So not that I think we've cracked the code, but I think that's the question we ask is, how do we build something that can be inherited, honored, and kept alive without being sort of a rigid, dead vehicle? And it's super important because individuals cannot hold futures alone. They cannot hold cultures alone. That is not how futures and cultures work. So, how do we make durable, visionary containers that can stand the test of time, right? And right now we're talking 50 years, 100 years, let alone, 500 years. So, um, yeah, check.
Thank you, Noni. I'm furiously taking notes.
So I would probably plus one that, but I think what I would say is when I think about institution, I think about the physical and systemic structure. So I think about structure and and for me and my motivation around the structure is that the work that we do at Community Dash Chicago is really about upsetting that structure and redefining that structure. And in most cases, it is both the physical structure of institutions in our neighborhoods, but also the systemic structure of what that looks like. And so our work is really based around how do we rethink power in neighborhoods, specifically who owns what. So we are a very physical, place-based sort of institution. So we really focus on the real estate side of our work. And so we believe that there is power in local ownership and power in residents being able to drive what happens in their neighborhoods. And so some of that is driven by the systems that are in place of these institutions and how we think about the way that capital flows into those neighborhoods. So we spend a good chunk of our time as we're talking about upsetting institutions or systems as I would see it, and thinking about differently in terms of what does that look like? Who's in control? Who has the resources? Who's managing the resources? And how does those resources get allocated? So a number of our programs in Chicago is really driven by that. Our Wealth Our Way program is providing direct capital grants to residents to be able to do this work in their neighborhood. And so I think to answer your third question, it is very important that we focus on recalibrating these institutions, because I think if we don't, at least from a Chicago's perspective, we will continue to see our neighborhoods and our communities in the conditions that they are, where we have very high vacancy rates in our corridors. We're saturated with liquor stores in substandard local markets or bodegas, depending on where you are. We call them grocery stores. I think the East Side folks, y'all call them bodegas. But the conditions of those resources in the neighborhood. And so it's important to be able to shift those institutions and who's controlling those neighborhoods by putting it in the hands of the residents that live there. So it's very important to us. I'll check there.
Nwamaka, did you want to go next? Yeah, I think just to build on and plus one to everything Noni and Ja'Net named, I think of institutions as like the set of rules, unwritten and written rules that kind of like structure everyday life, right? So if you think about the institution of property, that so many of us on this call are trying to undo the institution of property, the institution of marriage. Institutions are, in my mind, things, to Noni's point, that like stand the test of time, that reproduce themselves. They're not reliant on, one founder or one team or even one movement, right? Like they're things inherently that like reproduce themselves and become the kind of like water we swim in. We don't even think about it. Like we think about the institution of home ownership and the American dream and how like we are all, that's the other thing. I think like if we don't just shape institutions, like institutions shape us, right? And so when I think about the work that the Guild is doing, that the Desk is doing, that EB Prec is doing, I think about actually EB Prec's call to action around dreaming about land without landlords, right? Like that is an institution, a framework that I think we're all kind of working towards. I don't know that it's hard for me to say that I'm building an institution. That's aspirational. I think I'm hoping that that the Guild becomes an institution, not for the sake of like permanence of the organization, but I think it would like there's value in making sure that the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to land, the way those things become institutionalized. So maybe I'm less like married to the idea of the Guild being an institution and more like the things that we're trying to promote through our work become institutionalized. I also think like there's like and Noni spoke to this, but like there's a cultural element to institutions, right? This is like maybe like a little too academic, but like I think about Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony and how like the ruling class or like
Okay, I was just about to say, can you talk about that a little bit? Is that what you were just about to do just
I
now?
was about to,
Excellent.
yeah, just like talking about the theory of cultural hegemony, which is basically like that domination and oppression doesn't just happen through violence and force. It happens through cultural norms, and like what we call the status quo is shaped through like media, through churches and religious institutions, through schools, through everyday institutions that kind of manufacture a culture in which we're all implicated, right? And so it's not just domination does not just happen through force as this like theory. And so then I think about like, okay, well, what does it mean to build an institution that can shape culture differently? I'm thinking about like Ruth Wilson Gilmore's call to build life-affirming institutions, right? So if we understand that capitalism is a death-making system and institution, then what does it mean to build life-affirming institutions where we treat each other as people, where we relate to things like everyday needs like housing as a human right and not as sort of a commodity and profit. I'm just speaking to all the work that all of us on this call are doing. And so yeah, I think about like what does it take to build something that's so enduring that it just becomes the water you swim in and you don't have to think about it, because so much of our everyday life is marked by things we act in ways, whether we're like homeowner or tenant or consumer or entrepreneur, like all of the ways the identities that we inhabit are shaped by these like unwritten rules, like I said, that are shaped by institutions. And so I do think there's definitely value in your last question was like, do you think this is important? Absolutely. I think it's important. And I think we're seeing, I mean, in any era, but especially in this era, which has been there's an attack on every institution possible. A lot of our public institutions or a lot of our cultural institutions are under attack, and maybe some of them needed to be under attack, but a lot of it can be transformed. And yeah, I think about, for me personally, and from the guild's perspective, I think it's like an aspiration that our work becomes institutionalized, but I think about it in more of a collective sense than just our individual organization. Check.
Yeah, I don't know what more I can add to the brilliant comments of all these folks. So thank you, team. Um, yeah, I think what I would double click in on is, institutions as a place of exerting power, and figuring out the structures that ensure where certain power is held and where certain power is exerted over others. And when listening to us kind of talk about institutions, in one respect, it's like everything, but it's also nothing, because it is both entities and organizations, but it is also like ideologies and practices. So the way I was trained to think about institutions as this piece of a vehicle, I think it was Noni, or I forget who mentioned it, being a vehicle or container for certain ideologies or values or beliefs to be stewarded, for them to be studied, theorized, but then also practiced. And the practice is actually the exertion or the embodiment of that value out in society. And oftentimes, institutions are very rarely looking to exist kind of in their own vacuum on their own. They are really looking to shape the culture, the ways that society organizes itself, the ways that it relates to one another, the ways that it actually becomes self-referencing and understands who we know ourselves to be. And so, as you can kind of see in the examples, institutions are values agnostic, right? We have Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation being a right-wing think tank institution that has spent decades studying and writing and putting out policies that shape so much of the laws and the ways that we all live now. And I think it's important for us to be mindful of, like, when people are trying to create institutions, what is it that they're trying to build? What is it that they're trying to instill out in society? And then what is the ongoing discipline and practice? I think one of the things that's interesting for us as a group of people of color, I'm really thinking about solidarity economy work. There is an opportunity for us to reimagine what it means to build out institutions and to rather ask ourselves the questions of what are the values, what are the ideologies, what are the things that we are trying to seed out into community, and then what are the ways that we want to be in right relationship around how we manage the power of shaping society in that way. And so for me and my organization, it's interesting. Our organization, the Katali Foundation, was created to spend out. So we knew we were going to be a limited life organization or institution. And what that has always allowed us to do is to really think about what is it that we are trying to seed out in the world, so that once our organization is closed, we're not creating a vacuum, right? But we've actually been able to support a number of different organizations that are embodying the values and the vision that we have for what we hope the world can look like going forward. And so it's interesting to be in a place where the container has an expiration date, but the values continue to be a continuation of all the different political struggles that have happened around the world where people are continuing to try to figure out how do we get more free. So I think I'm like really holding institution in the long arc of the evolution of society, and how are we coming to redefine who we are as a human species and our place in the world. Now I'm starting to go out there, so let me bring it back to the last question. Do I think institutions are a good thing or not? I think it's all about how we use the power and force, and to what end, right? I think there are institutions that have brought a lot of good into the world, and institutions that have brought a lot of pain. I think the other thing that's interesting in this question that we didn't talk about is like who gets to set the agenda and who gets to lead the institution, right? The policies, the ideas. And I think, this question of do I think institutions are important? I'd first really want to understand, well, what is the agenda? What is the ideology? And who is leading it, and to what end? So yeah. Back to you, Nia.
Thank you, Amaka. Thank you so much. Thank you, Noni. Thank you, Ja'Net. Thank you, Nikishka. Thank you, Amaka. I want to ask the people in the room a question really quickly, and then we do have a couple of questions in the chat, and then I do have a couple of my own. But I'm just curious, for others in the room, did you hear anything in everyone's definitions of institution and whether or not they were building an institution and whether or not it was important? Did you hear anything that you didn't expect that was surprising? Did you hear anything that was expansive for you? I'm just curious. And you could put it in the chat or you could say it out loud. Out loud would be great though. I'm looking around. Petra, is your hand up?
Yeah.
Nia, can you hear me?
Yes, but so let's do stack real quick. Let's do Petra and then let's do you, Tamashi.
I think, yeah, this notion of inheritance is really interesting. And creating something that continues to give value to coming generations. So like creating something now that gives like value to those who are involved in it is one thing, but to create something that endures not because we want it to endure, but endures because it continues to give value is something really interesting.
Thank you, Petra. Tamashi, you're up next.
Hey, thank you. Petra was saying some of the things that I was feeling resonance with. I'll add to that with acknowledging the fragility of Black-led, BIPOC-led, what did you call them? It was Noni. The liberation ideology organizations or institutions, and watching, being present for the birth and death of organizations before the grandchildren of the founders can be born. I think acknowledging that fragility and anticipating it, working through it and around it, planning for it, planning with sensitivity. I think that that's really sobering and something that I've experienced and needed to reach out to other people for help to make sure that things didn't fall apart in one go round. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Tamashi. And I saw another hand go up, Miranda. Oh, well, dang. Miranda and then Fall.
I was still eating my grilled cheese sandwich. I didn't think I was gonna get called that fast. Yeah, I think that what Noni mentioned earlier about the um, the processes of how institutions, kind of just what the person before me said about how they have been able to both see the how a lot of them have only existed within one or two generations. I think that's a very important piece that's standing out to me. Sometimes that's why I was so interested in hearing this conversation, because sometimes for me, I'm really focused on the power of temporary, things, not wanting the longevity of things. And earlier this year, a poet, gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he talks about this idea of death doula, and like how sometimes it's about being a part of having something that was here that served its purpose, but also reckoning that there's power in the death of the thing as well. So it's making me really sit with that and juggle those things of like, and I also think about how our ancestors were always in flight, right? And that there was power in them always being in flight, and that there was not always opportunities for us to have longevity in what we were doing. So, what does that mean for how we are currently right now? In some ways, I guess, engaging in some form of like Afrofuturism when we're thinking about institutions and stuff and trying to build and do the things for our people. I think what Ja'Net said was a very concrete, like right now, we have a real thing that's going on in Chicago, and like we need to make sure that our people have what they need. And I think there's multiple ways of how this is playing out when I think of institutions, but I'm also like just very like, can we also lean into like the power of like the temporary aspect of it too, Yeah.
I appreciate that, Miranda. And I knew there was at least one person in the room who was probably like, So here's what I wonder. I see you, Fall, and I see you, Brandy. I think I want to give Noni an opportunity to answer your question, Miranda. And then I also do wonder, Amaka, if there's anything you would want to add. And you don't have to, but I'll be curious to see if how you would respond to Miranda's question, but maybe starting with Noni.
You might need to restate it, but where I heard Miranda's inquiry land is around the power of ushering out as much as the power of ushering in. Does that feel accurate? Because
Miranda,
it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to check with, so Miranda said yes in
Yeah.
the chat. That feels
Okay.
accurate.
And I'm one of those people that really like runs from death and endings, you know. But we have this other person on the call, Nwamaka, who birthed an institution to end the institution, right? And in a way, I've watched Katali usher themselves out by expressly handing the inheritance forward to those who were fed off of the organization while it lived, right? And if you want to get all like biomolecular about it, we know that like poop and decaying things like generate this very rich source of nourishment. And it's kind of natural in the biomolecular world. And I think in our, if you want to put it in our institutional world or organizational world, it's got to be intentional and purposeful. I was having a conversation about a year ago with Janelle Orsi, who is one of the co-founders of Sustainable Economies Law Center and who incubated and birthed EB-Prec along with my co-founders. And we sort of had this weird like 5-hour conversation where she was questioning whether EB-Prec should continue to live. As opposed to letting its resonance and its strategies filter out in the field where it remains radical. Because her concern was that our movement into the conventional market and the conventional practices, in some ways, she did not use this term, but in some ways was corrupting the transformative and revolutionary nature of what we seeded in the first place. In the abstract, I agreed with her. But the next day, when I had to get up and keep having meetings and keep bringing in capital for the next community-led project and negotiate down interest rates and pay my staff, that night, all night, I was like, yes, we're going to kill EB-Prec. That morning, I couldn't even like wrap myself around what I was gonna kill the night before. So I've been thinking a lot about that for the last year or so. And so far, only thing I've come up with is to pour into my mirror images inside the organization and to try to stabilize our radical mission. But I still ask myself at night, like, now what was I supposed to be killing again? And I can't quite grasp it. So I'll leave that there and let somebody else like have the answers that I clearly don't have.
Oh, thank you, Noni. Yeah, all right, Amaka, go. I see you jumping in. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't know that I have answers, but I find this conversation really interesting, the parallels that we're drawing between the permaculture of the natural world with decay and compost, but also like the cycle of a human life. And Noni, your comments about killing EB-Prec, at first I was like, oh no. But I mean, I understand what they were saying. And there is something to be said about, for all species, all life-giving things, what does it mean to be able to die with dignity? Right? And what does it mean to be able to set the terms and conditions under which you pass? And I don't even just mean like, let's live with dignity first, right? And then we can also think about dying with dignity. But I think this piece around, if an institution has surpassed its relevancy, its usefulness to the needs of people, then it becomes destructive, I think. And then I do think it makes sense for it to come to an eventual end, because when it continues to exert force over the lives of people in a way that is like, oh, that's not how I want to live, then that's where it starts to turn into that oppressive force. So like when Nikishka talks about like the institution of marriage, right, we can follow history and look at the institution of property and what it meant for marriage and all the things, and not just the way it impacted women and women expansive people, but also then like LGBTQIA plus communities and how they want to look at marriage. So that said, like the ways that some of us, not all of us, have come to think about marriage have shifted and evolved, but there are some that are still trying to like exert their own definition of what the institution of marriage is. So I think it's interesting for us to really reflect on, is there still usefulness for the ideology that this institution is trying to put forth in our society? And I was having a little geek out moment in the chat box because some of the things that we now call systems of oppressions, those did start as ideas that people would talk about, around the kitchen table, that grew into gatherings, then became like organizations, institutions, until it becomes, again, what Nikishka was talking about, the water we're swimming in. Like, we don't even think about capitalism, patriarchy, as institutions, we just think about of them as like this is just the world we're living in. This is just the way of life. So I think that that life cycle of an idea, and who gets to give birth to it, who gets to steward it, and then who gets to hospice it, all of those things I think are important for us to understand. What are the types of institutions that are important for us to craft? And then when do we know when it's time to step out? And to the point, because Noni had mentioned Katali. I mean, the thing with Katali as a foundation is, if we were trying to exert force to live into perpetuity, it would inherently mean that we would need to be making more money than we were giving away every year. And the only way that we could do that is if we stayed invested in the things that are actually doing harm to the very people that we care about, right? So that's what I mean around, like, is it relevant? Where is it exerting force? And so we wanted to hospice with dignity and pass on the inheritance. I love this language of our work to others.
Thank you, Amaka. Really appreciate this. Thal, your hand is now down, and I do still see you, Brandy. I haven't forgotten about you. Do you still want to weigh in, Thal, or?
Yeah, I would love to. Well, first, thank you everyone for your thoughts. My mind is like racing, trying to also take notes. But yeah, I mean, what everyone has been saying with how we're quite literally watching legacies rise and fall, within our day-to-day without even having the chance to breathe. And how institutions, in the way that I'm sure everyone in the room here wants to cultivate, it not only needs to be theorized, but exerted and embodied. Just the idea of the temporary, of life-giving within the temporary, life-giving within the death of the temporary, has been the most profound thing that I like, kind of came full circle to me, because I know I've been reflecting on the idea of institution making as gardening, and gardening our hearts. What does it mean to plant within a season? And what good is it to have a seed and to plant the seed if you don't have the means to cultivate the crop and to cultivate the environment to regenerate that crop, without still keeping that model the way that a lot of previous grassroots and nonprofits and NGOs try, where it's like you want to invest in communities that are poor and charitable cases, but then need them to continue being charitable cases, right? So I think that was the most like shift in my head of like, no, it needs to be temporary. The vehicle needs to be temporary. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Thal. Brandy, and then I do want to weigh in really quickly, and then there was an interesting conversation happening, questions from Donna in the chat that I want to lift up. Brandy, I'll give it to you now.
Yeah, I feel like I just want to say thank you to Noni and Ja'Net and Nikishka and Amaka, because like everybody else is like, and I think like you all, my mind is blown. I have like 17 different discussion threads and I'm trying to like corral them into a couple of coherent questions. So I'll do my best here. I think one of the things that I wanted to lift up is something that Nikishka said that I think is super important. We tend to associate institutions with violence, but I don't think we realize how much that's not actually typically the way they operate, and that the force of institutions is regular practice. And I think that like this is the thing, like when we're building institutions, as well as when we're trying to figure out how to dismantle them, like that's the thing that we're not always paying enough attention to, is that like all of these institutions are a series or a collection of regular practices between people that then define our identities, define our relationships, define what we think is possible. And so like really getting to understand that that's what these are helps us to understand how they change, but also helps us to understand like what we need to, what we need to be shifting or what we need to be looking at changing. And I deeply appreciated, Nikisha, I think this was something you were saying as well. But other people have alluded to it, about these being vehicles for exercising power, and particularly when you're talking about institution building for exercising power at larger and larger scales, hopefully power with people, not power over people necessarily, but also we're very used to power over being the model of how institutions work. And I think one of the biggest things coming for me from this conversation is like a little bit, I feel like we're trying to figure out, like, what's the rule? Is the rule that institutions should be? Is the rule that institutions should not be? And I feel like somebody lifted up criteria, like how do we actually determine whether an institution is or is not salvageable? And again, I feel like this is often a place where we don't go deep enough. We don't ask, like, what are the pros and cons? What are the costs and the benefits, and who is bearing or receiving them before we make that analysis? And I think there are all these places that folks are talking about, like, what's the transition into institutions? I'm thinking about this so much right now. And like, as we're building institutions, again, how are we shifting people's practice? And I think about the Dorchester Co-op that Gio mentioned, and like, so we this institution has been built, but one of the challenges that we're facing is that we haven't shifted people's practice and helped them to understand or address the gaps where we need to shift practice. And I say this as someone who has been a member of the co-op before, now lives in Dorchester again, and still really likes to buy my groceries at Star because they deliver them to my door. And so like, I'm thinking about this like on a really personal level right now. Like, what is it going to take for me to shift into supporting this institution? Because without that shift from me and a lot of other people, that institution will fail, but it doesn't have to. Um, and then, similarly, these criteria for like when we're making the transition out, because I really appreciated, I think, Amaka, you talking about like how you had to make it possible for people to transition out as you sunset the foundation in a way that wasn't just like, now wean yourselves off of us and good luck in the landscape of philanthropy and capitalism. Hope it works out for you, because we know that that's not actually a just transition. So these are, like I said, I've got like 17 things swirling in here. Those were the ones that I was able to pop out. But this is a super. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say. Sorry. I feel like anyway, for anyone on here who's CPGO, I feel like we could do like a whole like week or year or something of petty university on this and on this kind of conversation, because it's very, very dope and there's so much richness in here. So thank you all. This has been brilliant. Oh, thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Brandy. All right, so I want to just, for my part, I've been underlining in the notes that I was furiously taking some, I guess, there's some key terms, for lack of a better word, that jumped out to me, and we've heard some of these already in our reflections. But for me, I'm just kind of lifting these in terms of what I've heard in terms of how of defining an institution, what an institution is, and then we're gonna go to what Donna and Ja'Net have been talking about. So vehicle, and what was interesting, Noni, when you first said vehicle, I was thinking metaphorically, and then you started talking about tires. I was like, oh wow, like actual car. So just kind of noting multiple definitions of vehicle, but I have here vehicle, culture has been mentioned a few times. And both singular and plural, so culture and cultures, households, organizations. Nona, you even said even movements that are headless or appear to be headless or leaderless can be institutions. Um, Ja'Net talked about like actual physical institutions as well as systems. Um, Nikishka talked about a set of rules and also frameworks. So Amaka lifted this up a little bit in terms of thinking about property and marriage. For example, land without landlords, the example from E.B. Pratt, really just kind of appreciating this thing about frameworks. Water. So we've been talking about this, just like what's the air, what's the water. Um, Amaka talked about exerting power, so not just power but like actually exerting it. And then we also heard about practice a couple of times. So practice and discipline. There's also this notion that institutions are values agnostic. So, and I think there was also this conversation in terms of direction. So Amaka talking about not just institutions shaping us, but also how we shape institutions. Uh, Also, definitely, I think heard a lot of that in your remarks, um, Noni. So thinking about the connection between culture and what different types of institutions take from our wider cultures. And then there's also this notion of time, temporality versus more permanence, limited life, really good conversation on that. And then also with time, Amaka talked about thinking about this in terms of the long arc of the evolution of our society. So for me, just throwing that out there, because I think we just got a lot from that from that one question. So this is almost for me a bit of a summary of what we heard as well as what touched you all, and uh, what you reflected on. So now what I want to do really quickly is just lift up conversations that were happening in the chat. So Donna initially asked Janae in the chat, is your organization an institution or forced to impact institutions or both? How does it address the issue Noni raised of being able to pass on intergenerationally in the midst of change? I think we had a pretty good conversation about that. And then Donna followed up and asked, is that important or is it just different work? Um, and went on to say, I think hearing the conversation and the complexities of it is exciting. Janae responded, great question. I think we are both, but more of a force. We could be considered an institution because our work in Chicago is changing the way support shows up in communities. We are reshaping the definition of an intermediary for communities. That's an interesting thread we're not going to have time for, fortunately, Janae, but we can maybe think about a future conversation on that for sure. We are forced because we consider ourselves as a disruptor of business as usual. Regarding significant amount of time building capacity in neighborhoods to be sustainable long term. And let me just check. Okay, so I'm being told to do stuff. All right. Had to check that chat. Amaka said, this conversation is making me think about how ideologies that are practiced and spread through institutions become the systems and structures that shape our lives. Capitalism, patriarchy, all systems of oppression started as ideologies, belief systems that individuals spread across societies through institutions. Oh, that was another word I meant to call out. So we talked about this notion of self-reproducing. Um, Democracy as an institution in the US is an ideology. The US is spreading across the world through force. Donna said, I think we forget that a lot of who we are comes from those who stood as much in place as they could. For me, there were institutions that I didn't think would come under such effective attack. I thought they'd still be working. And let's see, TJ, just want to lift this up, said, I appreciate Janae's differentiation of both physical and systemic structures when defining institutions. They are certainly intertwined in Chicago and other local regions. And I just want to make sure we got everybody. Miranda, in response to Brandy, said, Brandy, your words are making me think of the life-affirming comment that was Nikishka about institutions. And I think Nikishka was referencing Ruth Wilson Gilmore there. That was lifted earlier in the conversation. Tamika said, this is such an interesting perspective for me. I was working in hospice while my son was fighting for his life in the NICU. At the same time, I was witnessing endings and beginnings. It made me realize that institutions have life cycles too. Some should evolve, some should end, and some should be built to outlive us. As I'm building a worker cooperative, I'm thinking less about creating a successful business and more about creating an institution that can renew itself through the community it serves. That's what makes an institution worth preserving. Wow, this is an amazing discussion. And I was being told I gotta wrap it up. It's 7:15. I'll end with, I guess, this last comment that is here. And I think people who know me know I always do this to people. Always spring a second part. So I'm going to say out loud, it seems like definitely a part two is due, and we'll think about when that'll happen. But Tamashi, last comment in the chat said, I think a lot about how much artists across disciplines, and especially visual artists, require essential facilities that are stable to hold equipment and function, studio spaces for learning, making, and passing on productive creative practices. For us, institutional stability is key, while the longevity and accessibility of traditional art school is increasingly precarious. And quoting Donna and saying, I thought certain institutions would still be working. My whole life has been shaped by access to visual artists led and focused institutionally in and out of schools. I want this power to be with us and not in schools that exclude so many of us. And on that, thank you all so much. I gotta go. We gotta go. But let's unmute. Let's please give a warm thank you to Noni, Ja'Net, Nikishka, and Amaka. All four of you, thank you so very much.
Yeah,
I
thank
this
you
incredible.
all.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Thank you.